Good morning. How are you? It's only Tuesday, 3 minutes after 10. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'm just trying to think back to conversations we've had about the environment and find a way of sort of encapsulating the general thrust of all of them. And I think one of the things I found most fascinating, both from a professional and a personal perspective, is that question of the pivot point, that question of the point of no return, over which many people have now gone, thank God, because they are in many ways looking out for the rest of us. But many of us, even though we can say things like that, thank goodness for the people who recognise the importance of campaigning to address climate change. I can say that out loud, but I haven't gone over the point of no return. I haven't gone over the hill, over the top, actually, if you want to use a wartime analogy. I haven't glued myself to anything. I haven't really taken to the streets. I've talked about it, but I do that every day, talking about something. And it's interesting, isn't it, what prompts that switch? Another really interesting development of the last few years has been the complete disappearance of the stereotype, albeit that much of the media still pretends that the stereotype exists, and anybody risking their liberty and indeed in some cases their personal security. It's Wednesday, not Tuesday. That was a joke, by the way. It wasn't a joke. I got the day wrong. So let's just pause for a minute to reflect upon the first 30 seconds of today's programme. Well, I was reading something yesterday about people being bad at their job. What was I reading yesterday about people being bad at their job? And I'll tell you what it was. It was all the people who are claiming that the investigation into Russell Brand's behaviour is somehow motivated by the things he's been saying about, I don't know, vaccines, is it? Or the World Economic Forum? I haven't really been keeping up. And someone tweeted that if you'd spent 30 seconds in a media organisation, the idea that there would be some massive conspiracy, carefully orchestrated, fine-tuned, with all of the powerful voices in the industry all pushing in the same direction, you would laugh your head off at the idea that anyone could organise this kind of thing. People are taken by surprise by Christmas in my industry. People regularly in the sort of the middle of October will start thinking, oh my God, we've got to get the Christmas edition out. I hadn't even thought about it, or we've got to do the Christmas rotas. And I was thinking I wanted to do a quote tweet pointing out how useless I am. And I nearly tweeted, sometimes I get the time wrong. I nearly tweeted that last night. So somewhere in the back of my mind, I came on air this morning and got the day wrong in order to write a zinging tweet at some unspecified point in the future when I find myself in a similar situation to the one that I've just described to you. Also, it's a good way of checking whether my inbox is working. I will now receive, thanks to Catch Up and the ability to rewind live radio, I will now receive messages saying, James, don't think so. It's definitely Wednesday, says Thomas in Q. I will now be receiving messages like that until 1 o'clock, given the popularity now of listening on delay or with a bit of catch-up or taking advantage of the rewind function. But I digress. 6 minutes after 10 is the time. It's only Wednesday. So many people just run out of the house, bounced out of the building. All right, stop. The stereotype, the collapse of the stereotype, the destruction of the stereotype. When I was young, the stereotype was swampy, the fella who dug a tunnel, I think it was in a woods. They were going to chop down a woods in order to build a road. And quite a visionary young man looking back was so committed to protecting the environment in that case. I don't think it was a Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion type ideology. It was more a protect the wild, protect the woodland ideology. But there's a big intersection, isn't there? And he had sort of dreads and looked like he probably, lived a hippie lifestyle. And the temptation, which no one really resisted, was to typify anybody with profound environmental concerns as being some sort of dropout or some sort of hippie or some sort of feckless work-shy layabout. And that did quite a lot of damage. That stayed in place for quite a long time. But the new generation of environmental campaigner is a million miles away from that stereotype. You're looking at sort of retired accountants, and you're looking at lawyers and vicars and housewives, people who've got jobs, people who've got big stakes in society, and the determination they have to push this urgent mission forward is wonderful to behold. And again, I say it was the Newbury bypass. So yes, that's right. Thank you. Inbox on fire today. So apparently it's Wednesday. The point I'm making is about the pivot. is that I've wondered for some time what it would take to get people who know that they should care more to care more. Do you see what I mean? So academically, in the abstract, even objectively, the net zero is something that more of us should be getting really, really worked up about. And yesterday, by accident, I think Rishi Sunak stumbled upon one way in which you could get some of us who are even ashamed, perhaps, of our own lethargy on this issue to feel more engaged. And Rishi Sunak's wheeze was to announce that they're going to do even less than they are already, at which point I think you'd have to be pretty stupid not to respond. But that's not fair. Pretty stupid and or deeply misinformed. It's important to recognise that. In fact, the reference to whatever Russell Brand's conspiracy theorist friends are arguing this week is a good example of the importance of remembering that some of it will be stupidity, but some of it will be deep misinformation. You look at that and you sort of think to yourself, how can he be now proposing doing even less than we do already? And then you look at people in support of the idea, and it's like a rogues gallery of imbeciles. Liz Truss thinks it's a good idea. Suella Braverman is supporting it today. And you sort of find yourself thinking, well, this sort of cavalcade of imbeciles surely will make people realise it's a really stupid plan. And then you remember that, 49% of the population is of below average intelligence. It's a statistical fact, or thereabouts. It's not 49.999 recurring or something. But anyway, here's the point I think that we should focus on first. So the leaked proposals, leaked presumably by someone in Downing Street, horrified by the idea of Rishi Sunak giving a speech in which he pledges to water down commitments to net zero. Net zero is the ideal, the plan, the target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to zero. So there won't be any more greenhouse gas emissions being put into the environment by, I think, 2030. The point that I want you to take on board before you start reaching for your phone to text me weird stuff that you got off your Uncle Derek's Facebook page, the intervention that I want you to pick up on first is the one from Ford Motors. Okay, Ford Motor Cars. So here is the point at which you have to decide whether you take the Daily Mail's editorial line or Liz Truss's well-documented genius as your guiding light on this issue, or whether you were going to listen to what Ford Motor Cars have to say. Because who is Rishi Sunak pandering to on this? Is he pandering to the motor industry, which probably knows a little bit about the motor industry? Or is he pandering to people who have proven their idiocy on the grandest scale in the most spectacular way for the best part of 6 or 7 years? I don't know, but here's what Ford have to say. Our business needs 3 things from the UK government: ambition, commitment, and consistency. Okay, this is Ford Motor Cars. You're familiar with Ford Motor Cars, right? A relaxation of 2030 would undermine all 3. So, I mean, I struggle really to understand how a government can press ahead with a motor policy that not only recognises the environmental emergency, but also alienates the motor industry. So Rishi Sunak's plan is to alienate the people. Well, the environmental project is to abandon or dilute the environmental project and alienate the motor industry. I'm not going mad, am I? That's objectively incredible. Now, it may be that I'm missing something with regard to Ford, and you will be able to tell me, but remember, it has to be proper knowledge. It can't come from your Uncle Derek's Facebook page. I can't quite conceive of why a Prime Minister would frame a policy regarding cars in a way that will both alienate the environmental lobby, if you like, or will damage the environment, will further damage the environment, okay, on the one hand, and on the other hand, it will alienate the motor industry. It might be, and it's so hard to tell because you and I have to do all this on our own. We haven't got any other media we can go to really for guidance because they're all either so far up the fundament of the Tory party that they've forgotten what day it is, or they're busy arguing about transgender toilets. We have to do this ourselves. And there are some days I fear when we perhaps get it wrong. But the sheer idiocy of a policy regarding motor cars that alienates both the motor industry and the environmental lobby — I want a better word than lobby, but lobby's the best that I can come up with — is, I think, perhaps one of the stupidest political interventions I've ever seen. Phone lines are open. Is it one of the stupidest political interventions that we've ever seen? Is it? Or am I missing something? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Quick visit to Idiot's Corner. Paul says, so you completely bypass the fact that by that time people will still not be able to afford electric cars. You won't have to buy an electric car. They just won't make any more petrol and diesel cars, mate. It's a bit like all the people who thought that ULEZ meant they weren't allowed to drive their car around anymore. They'd have to go out and buy a Sinclair C5. It's just not true. This is what I mean by misinformation, Paul. So I was throwing you a little bone earlier when I said you're either stupid or deeply misinformed. What happens now is you prove whether you're stupid or deeply misinformed by deciding whether you're going to cling to that position after you've been made aware of the facts by your humble presenter, or whether you're now going to change your mind and recognise that no one requires you to buy an electric car in 2030. They're just not going to make any more petrol and diesel cars. I can't quite get my head around what bad politics this is. And if I were to seek to, what would the word be, pique your interest in this, I would suggest to you with a straight face that from where I'm sitting, what Rishi Sunak is doing looks a lot like framing a vaccine policy in order to appease anti-vaxxers. I mean, it's not even good news for the motor industry, but I presume it will be welcomed by the fossil fuels lobby. So I'd go a little further. What Rishi Sunak appears to be doing with net zero is framing a policy that in the context of vaccines would be designed not only to delight anti-vaxxers, but also to suck up to the companies that have a monopoly on flogging fake cures. Was it ivermectin that people were bleating about not long ago? So it's as if he's looked at the science and then he's looked at some idiots on Facebook and he's thought, I'm going with the idiots on Facebook on this one. I'm going with the imbeciles. And there's not just science, but also the motor industry on the other side of the river going, this is a really bad idea. Excuse me, Mr. Sunak, Chief Executive of Ford Motors, one of the biggest car producers in the world, got some investments in your country, albeit, like all other motor companies, we're only investing in this country after you give us massive, massive sweeteners to make up for the fact that you've cut us off from our biggest market. But we are still here. We're still making cars. Really, really bad idea. Really bad idea, Prime Minister. Oh, you know what Ford are? They're just a bunch of hippies. A bunch of hippies who hate cars. Why do Ford hate cars? I mean, you see what I mean? If you thought I was being a little impolite about idiots on Facebook, you're essentially now appeasing people who think that anybody who's in favour of net zero hates cars. And that now includes Ford Motors. Ford Motors. This is almost unbelievably silly, I think. You know how phone-ins work. You can disagree. 0345 6060 973. £430 million Ford has invested in its UK facilities as part of the 2030 target. Jobs, industry, incredible. It's a war on motorists, the idiots on Facebook, and sadly on the telly and the radio and in your newspapers will tell you. It's a war on motorists. Whose side are you on? Well, that's a difficult question, actually, because under my crass and imbecilic reading of this situation, Ford Motors are a large part of the war on motorists. Do you know the other question I've got for you? This you could see almost as an amnesty for your Uncle Derek's Facebook page. Who is Rishi Sunak appealing to with this nonsense? 0345 6060 973. There is an argument that when a politician, a prime minister in particular, is being absolutely spanked in the polls, as Rishi Sunak surely is, a form of desperation creeps in. It's born of panic. And they try to come up with something that they don't particularly believe in or even perhaps understand, but they think it will appeal to an unspecified rump of voters. This is what I mean by your Uncle Derek's Facebook page. People who will look at this announcement today and look at the fact that Ford Motors think it's stupid and still claim that the net zero target, that stepping back, that diluting the commitment to the net zero target is a good idea. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. That was quite a roundabout introduction, wasn't it? I thought a particular highlight was getting the day wrong while then going on to describe everybody else as stupid. I think that goes down as a bit of a win, I think, for the team. But I mean, also, obviously, the question of how do you greet the news that Rishi Sunak is poised to weaken some of the government's key green commitments, both manifesto commitments and I'm pretty sure legal obligations. So focus on the appalling politics of it and the question of who the hell Rishi Sunak is trying to appease with this nonsense, but also your personal reaction to the news, because it might be positive. I hope I haven't alienated you completely. Your personal reaction to the news that Rishi Sunak's latest desperate attempt to secure votes from silly people is to apparently pledge to weaken commitments to absolutely urgent environmental commitments. It's coming up to 20 past 10 and it's definitely Wednesday. 22 minutes after 10. James, please stop having a go at blokes called Derek or I'll switch to Planet Rock. Best regards, Derek. He has a point. I mean, I had to wean myself off Keith because I've got a colleague called Keith saying your Uncle Keith's Facebook. And then I went down the Auntie Doris route, didn't I? We started talking about your Auntie Doris's Facebook page. A lovely lady called Doris rang in high dudgeon she was in. High, the highest of dudgeons. And weirdly, as I'm trying to find a word or a name to describe the kind of character that I'm thinking of when I talk about downloading idiocy from your Uncle Derek's Facebook page, I glanced to my right and Tim Weatherspoon is on the telly. And he is the bloke, really, that could be the patron saint of the kind of people that I'm talking about. The sort of little human thundercat. That's not even his name, is it? He's not called Tim Weatherspoon. He's called something else. Tim Martin. But, all right, so I can't say your Uncle Derek's Facebook page. What can I say? Uncle Nigel's? I'm not. Nigel's have surely suffered enough. Imagine going through your life with a perfectly innocuous name like Nigel and then forevermore being associated with one of the most stubborn skid marks on the underpants of British politics. Eesh. So we can't go for Nigel. Anyway, we're digressing slightly. We're supposed to be talking about net zero. Stuart's in Harrow. Stuart, what would you like to say?
I'd like to say that I'm very happy that there's at least been some pushback from climate alarmism. I think the good thing also is that the BBC will be forced to treat the issue fairly, and I think the anti-vaxxers are actually the climate alarmists. And it's ironic that the people, do you know how much net zero is projected to cost by the Office of OFBC?
No idea, no, Stuart.
Well, you should, if
Why?
you're a radio presenter, because it's 1.4 billion pounds.
So what's that in the context of, what did we spend on PPE, was it, and on track and trace? Was that 33?
Sorry, 1.4 trillion pounds.
Well, that sounds like quite a lot. And what do we get in return?
Absolutely, not very much, actually. What do you think
we get a safer planet and we live for longer. Why do you think Ford are opposed to it?
As one person from Ford, first of all, he's not banning. He's stopping the ban. He's stopping the ban on petrol cars.
No, why do you think Ford are opposed to it?
I have no idea if one person's opposed
to it. It's not one person. It's Ford Motor Company. It's an official statement. It's an official statement. Stuart, stop it. You can't say it's one spokesperson. He is the spokesperson for the Ford Motor Company.
They've invested a lot of money. The mistake.
So why are they opposed to it? Why are they spooked by it?
Boris Johnson made a mistake. He shortened it from 2035 to 2030. Other European countries are doing 2030.
So what is the benefit of alienating a company that have invested £430 million in the company?
That money's gone. It's not realistic. Obviously,
what is the benefit of doing it?
I'm talking about net zero. I'm not talking about petrol consumption in general.
No, well, I am. Because what made me think this topic is really interesting and this decision is clearly crackers is the fact that he's alienated both people who are concerned about the environment, unlike you, and people who make cars, unlike you. But you know better than both of them.
I think it shows someone's insincere person.
Well, I completely agree that it shows insincerity, but you're in favour of it.
If you obsess about climate change, right, as you think it's an incredible emergency, and you think we should spend £1.4 trillion not fixing it, right, not making any difference to the problem, even if it is a
No, you can't say that it will cost £1.4 trillion to do it and then say that it won't work.
Well, it won't work. Do you think it will change the weather?
No, of course it won't change the weather. It will change the amount of fossil fuel gases, greenhouse gases, that have been put into the environment.
First of all, you don't know how much it will cost. Do you know how many people are dying or living? Is climate change killing people, or is it saving lives?
Climate change is obviously killing people, Stuart.
How many people is it? How's it killing them?
It's killing them through the air that they breathe, the pollution that they absorb, the lung disease, the heart disease. Listen, Stuart, I'm delighted that you're bringing all the contents of your Facebook page to the programme. But the question that I'm asking is,
you don't know anything about
why do you think Rishi Sunak has done this? And the answer is
for politics,
to delight people like you. And my question is, why is he prioritising you over Ford Motor Company and the environmental lobby?
So I think Labour will follow it.
Listen, if I say what time it is and you say it's raining outside, the conversation becomes slightly frustrating. Why is Rishi Sunak prioritising you and your opinions and insights and expertise over both Ford Motors and the environmental lobby?
Because he's being realistic, I guess.
Okay. Because Stuart knows better.
No, James knows better. You don't even know how much it's going to cost.
I am following the lead of both the environmental experts and the motor lobby. So what is it?
You haven't even looked at the cost of the. That's how sincere you are.
So here's the question. Final time. Why is Rishi Sunak prioritising Uncle Stuart's Facebook page over both Ford Motor Company and the environmental, and 90-odd% of scientific consensus?
What is the consensus?
The question is, why is Rishi Sunak...
You're throwing up a lot of straw men.
Why? Okay, the consensus is people qualified academically to investigate this area, all arriving at very similar peer-reviewed conclusions. So the question is...
Do you know what the IPC said? He said climate alarmism is dangerous.
If my peacock laid an egg in your garden, who would it belong to? So here is the question. Here is the question, Stuart. Why is Rishi Sunak prioritising you and your internet...
Not me.
Yes, you, because you're here as the representative. You're here as the representative of people who like this policy. Why is he prioritising you over Ford Motor Company and pretty much every environmental scientist in the... Please let me finish the question. Why is he prioritising you over the Ford Motor Company and pretty much every environmental scientist in the world?
He's following every other European country.
No, that's not the question I asked you.
Because it's a silly question. It's a false question, isn't it?
It's a really good question. It's a brilliant question. It's a brilliant question.
You're the anti-vaxxer because you're refusing
No,
to
you're
go
the
into
anti-vaxxer.
detail.
It's a brilliant question. Why is he prioritising you? All you have to do is give me the detail.
He's not prioritising me.
He is.
He's being realistic.
He's being what?
He's being realistic. We wouldn't be able to make that pledge anyway.
And when when Ford Motor Company says that what we need from business is ambition, commitment, and consistency, a relaxation of 2030 would undermine all three. Final question, Stuart. Tell Ford what they're getting wrong.
They're getting wrong as they listen to Boris Johnson because it was his mistake.
Right.
In the first place.
So Ford have listened to Boris Johnson, and that's okay. No, I respect you. You finally gave me an answer to a question. So Ford Motor Company's attitude to this potential policy change is a consequence of them listening to Boris Johnson.
Well, obviously, he made policy, but you have avoided the subject.
No, thank you.
You haven't answered any question. You don't know the facts.
I know all the facts I need to know to ask you why. Okay, here we go. Boris Johnson. They listened to Boris Johnson. Ford listened to Boris Johnson.
You don't know how much it's going to cost.
Yes, I do. You told me it's going to cost £1.4 trillion.
Well, then you don't think it's important? You
Pardon?
went on for years correctly talking about Brexit and how that's going to harm the British economy, and you don't think £1.4 trillion should just be dismissed?
No, I think that Brexit is going to harm the British economy because all of the people who are in the business of manufacturing and producing explained why it would. And now the people who are in the business of manufacturing and producing are explaining why this is a very bad idea. But Stuart thinks it's a good idea.
The £1.4 trillion, right? What would you not spend it on?
Stuart thinks it's a good idea because Ford listened to Boris Johnson.
When you hold a radio,
I'm late for the news.
Do some research.
Okay, well, I have done some research. I've done some research into what. Stop saying £1.4 trillion as if it sort of closes the conversation down. It doesn't. This is about.
I think a radio presenter that produces a program should at least do a basic research.
Okay.
And know what a policy costs, and at least try to give the upside.
Net zero 2030 is supported by 90-odd% of the world's scientists and now the motor industry. It is opposed by, for the purposes of this conversation, you. And if your answer to the question of why you're opposed to it is because of how much it costs, that counts as a vaguely valid contribution.
Vaguely? Okay. And it's not 2030, it's 2050. That's for starters.
We're talking about 2030 today. We're talking about 2030 today. We're talking about 2030 today and the extension to 2035. But anyway, I will take on board your contributions and I will look further into what it was that Ford Motors did with reference to what Boris Johnson had to say on the subject a few years ago. And I think we've answered or at least solved the problem of whose Facebook page we're going to be talking about for the rest of today's programme. 10:35 is the time, and the bits from the figures that Stuart was throwing at us a minute ago, I think he mentioned 1.4 trillion. So often it's probably gone up due to inflation by the time that call ended. But the bits you won't get off Uncle Stuart's Facebook page, from the same report that he referred to, that shows an early action scenario would add 21% of GDP to public sector net debt by 2050. So that's about £450 billion in today's terms, smaller than the amount of additional net debt the government took on in response to the pandemic. So question number one would be, what's the biggest deal, the climate crisis or the pandemic? But crucially, the same forecast from which this 1.4 trillion figure came said that if the UK took no action to curb emissions, the debt to GDP ratio could skyrocket to a record high of 289%. So taking action looks at adding 21% of GDP to public sector net debt. Not taking action sees that figure rocket to 289%. So listen, if you want to cite that report, obviously you have to cite all of it, which says very expensive, but a tiny fraction of what it would cost to do nothing. And that's the end of my TED Talk. 10:36 is the time. Richard's in Bristol. Richard, what would you like to say?
Hi, I work for a Mercedes agent, so I talk to customers all day long about electrification of cars, hybrid cars, and it's just so confusing for customers when we sort of switch tack like this part way through, and if manufacturers have guidance and timelines and timescales to work to and make investment to introduce new models.
Ambition, commitment, consistency, and you're talking chiefly about the consistency bit, I think.
Yeah, and when this legislation was introduced, the politicians said, well, the manufacturers will just have to step up. They'll just have to make the technology to meet these requirements. And by and large, they have done. I think we were going towards 2030. The 2030 date was to make all new cars hybrid. So it was either petrol electric or diesel electric. And we were pretty much...
So to sell no more petrol only or diesel only cars.
Yeah, there would be an electric element within everything. And I think from my viewpoint, speaking personally, my manufacturer was accommodating that. And every new model launch, there was a hybrid element to all. When you lifted the bonnet, that wasn't just a combustion engine. There was an electric part as well, integral within it. The roll-on from this that they haven't discussed is that 5 years later, we were going to an electrification only in 2035.
Yes.
So I assume there's another conversation coming where that must be put back, I assume, because if you're able to...
just sort of thinking out loud about, I think we've got a clearer picture now of the kind of voter that Rishi Sunak's trying to appeal to. Is it possible that, because if the manufacturers are already on board with Plan A, that they would probably ignore Plan B, and it becomes, I'm just thinking out loud, so don't laugh at me, it just becomes something he can say that he's done, even though the manufacturers have actually stayed on Plan A. Do you see what I mean?
They probably will, because they're all worldwide manufacturers accommodating governments around the world and their legislation. And I think the UK had got timescales that were leading the world, and we were early in our adoption of hybrid power plants. But premium manufacturers already had these designs in the pipeline. So we're still going to get those powertrains coming through. When you pop the bonnet on your car in London, it's not going to be vastly different to when you pop the bonnet in Berlin or Paris.
Sure.
It's going to be
it can't be. So, crikey, that makes it an even stranger policy intervention, doesn't it? So, is that exceptionalist then? That sort of thinking that the UK will have different rules, but the manufacturers, except perhaps, I don't know, a small kit car company in Stoke Newington, the manufacturers will still be following the rules that we are now poised to step back from.
Yeah, there'll be a worldwide direction.
It's just madness. So why has he done it then? What's your view on why? And you're not allowed to say because something Boris Johnson. Why do you think Rishi Sunak has done this, or is poised to do this now?
I think the Uxbridge by-election result. I think the local media feedback from most people is negative when you talk about congestion zones. In Bristol, they were going to ban diesel cars completely in the initial scenario, and people bailed out of their diesel cars in 2017, 2018. The price crashed. Yeah. So that did directly cost people money. Their car was worth less. Yeah. And they thought, I've got to change this because I won't be able to drive it in Bristol. So locally, that was a massive impact.
I think you're onto something there. I think if you look at things that they could celebrate from since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, losing an enormous majority in Uxbridge and replacing it with a wafer-thin majority is the closest thing they've had to a win. And they think that was born of using motoring as part of a sort of culture war and telling an awful lot of lies about who was going to pay more and who was going to be affected. But they can chalk that up as a win. They hung on to the seat, albeit that they hemorrhaged votes and would have lost if everyone who voted Green voted Labour. Therefore, this is simply a really quite crass attempt to reinflate that element of culture war by accusing or claiming to be on the side of the motorist.
Yeah, politically, it's an easy win.
Well, is it because then
of the electorate?
Yeah, all right, for a certain section of the electorate. And because how can you be?
It completely wrongfoots Labour. What do they say in response?
I think they'll hold the line on this.
Do they go for it? Where do they go with it?
I think they'll probably hold the line because you can't really claim that you're on the side of the motorist when all the motoring manufacturers are lined up on the other side of the field, can you? Or can you? Well,
certainly if I was a manufacturer, I'd be saying, well, hang on, you've laid out this legislation, we've towed the line, and we've invested heavily, and we've had some big investments from, motor manufacturers in the UK in the past year regarding electrification of the fleet. And they're now going to look at the UK and say, well, hang on, what are you going to do next year?
What are you going to do next and what are you going to swing on then? And what, I guess in some ways you're at the sharp end of this, dealing with the day-to-day reality of trying to sell cars. But then again, obviously, if a spokesman for Ford isn't speaking for Ford, then it's only fair to point out that Richard is not speaking for the entire motoring industry, just the difficulties of trying to flog cars in a market where the rules keep changing. I find the politics of it, because of my problems, in terms of my interests and priorities, the politics of it, even more fascinating than the environmental impact. But I know that the next caller will find that position vaguely obnoxious because the environmental impacts of these sort of policies are, for her at least, truly a matter of life and death. Rosamond Kissi-Debrah, the mother, of course, of Ella Roberta Adu Kissi-Debrah, has been campaigning tirelessly since her daughter became the first in Britain whose death was actually attributed to excessive air pollution. Back in 2013, her 9-year-old died. Rosamond, what made... I know I've got some business to do for you, but what made you pick up the phone today? Oh, could just sort that phone. Can we just sort that phone line out with Rosamond? I'll take a little junction and we'll come straight back. It's 10:44. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It is 10:47, and it is the day on which the UK Prime Minister appears to have attempted to take a side in the war on motorists and alienated the biggest motor manufacturers in the world, which is quite an achievement, really, considering that it's not even 11 o'clock yet. As I mentioned a moment ago, for Rosamond Adu Kissi-Debrah, this is actually a matter of life and death. Her 9-year-old daughter, Ella, became the first person in history whose death was attributed to excessive air pollution. And as I mentioned, she's been campaigning tirelessly since then on the issue. So, I mean, I'm not unclear as to why you would have rung in today, Rosamond, and we will definitely mention and push people towards your petition in a moment. But first, can I ask you why you think Rishi Sunak is doing this now?
Yeah, it's a very easy answer. He thinks it's going to win the election. As simple as that.
Yeah, I guess so. And regardless of fact, science, life, death, clean air, whatever it may be, he is focusing on a very specific part of the electorate and feeding them.
Yeah, he's looking at a certain group of people. He thinks this is going to get him over the line. But may I warn you, the motor industry, I just heard the bit that you've been talking about. They are going to be very unhappy. Everything is costed to 2030.
Yes.
And as we speak now, there's a climate week going on in New York. Where is he? Where's our Prime Minister?
I think the Mayor of London's there.
Oh, is he? Oh, is that where Mr. Khan is? Okay.
I think the Mayor of London's there. We're catching up with him later. But the question of why Rishi Sunak isn't there has perhaps been answered overnight with this leak about his plans to actually swim against the tide of international progress and instead water down our commitments to reducing greenhouse gases. It's still not a great phone line, Rosamond. So tell us quickly, if you can, about the clean air. Well, the petition urging the House of Commons to find time to take a clean air human rights bill through the House.
We need 100 signatures, and there will actually be a debate on.
Right, I'm going to do it instead because the phone line's not up to it. This is why you should always come into the studio, Rosamond. So I'll do it on your behalf. It is a petition that is being put to the UK government. The bill, of course, has been agreed by the House of Lords with cross-party support, and the petition is designed to urge the government to find the time to take it through the House of Commons so that it can become law. It stands, as we speak, at 6,343 signatures, and I'll tweet it now. So if you go to @Mr. James OB, then you can add your signature to that petition, and we'll catch up with Rosamond at a later date. 10 minutes to 11 is the time. We have a new political editor at LBC, and I'm quite hurt that she chose to make her debut this morning on Nick Ferrari's programme, but
don't take it personally.
But Natasha Clark is here now to make amends. You've got a tale of truss for us,
I've got a story
Natasha,
for you.
and welcome aboard.
You're very welcome. And I've actually got a story for you. I didn't have a story for Nick earlier. Yes, thanks so much for having me, and I'm very delighted to join you guys today as LBC's new political editor. Go easy on me, yeah?
Of course.
So the story I've got for you today, Liz Truss has raked in £250,000 in just a year since leaving office, LBC can reveal today.
Which is a fraction of what Boris Johnson has.
It is. I think Boris Johnson's on more than 5 million, if I recall my figures correctly. However, Liz Truss's stats, break them down by hour, £16,000 an hour.
What, for every hour of the year since she stopped being Prime Minister? For every hour that she was Prime Minister?
For every hour that she has worked, which is only a few hours in office.
Oh,
out of office so far.
And who is paying her these sort of funds?
Yeah, so we've got a long list of people that she's been doing speeches for. The most lucrative one was a speech in Taipei in June for the Prospect Foundation, another for the APB USB network, another £6,000 for one at Tokyo University, flights and accommodation paid for on top of that. But I think we just wanted to come back to the point that I wanted to make here, is that obviously she's earning that on top of A, her salary as an MP, B, her salary, the costs that she gets from being a former Prime Minister.
Yeah,
so we pay her as the taxpayer £115,000 a year on top of that to do our office costs and to pay for our private security.
I mean, the problem that we have, Natasha, is that, and you were formerly at the Sun newspaper, where of course you would have been on the phone to the Taxpayers Alliance
we would have done, yes,
in a heartbeat for a comment on money being spent on diversity officers or on, I don't know, sundry other things for the greater good. Organisations like the Taxpayers Alliance stay strangely silent about people like Liz Truss, and I believe she was or is still seeking to give a peerage to the former chief executive of the Taxpayers Alliance.
Yeah, that one's on hold a bit, isn't it?
It is a bit. But so it leaves us struggling a little bit to focus on how egregious this actually is. All former Prime Ministers use public money to run an office. All former Prime Ministers trouser huge sums of cash to tour the world giving speeches about how they're more sinned against than sinning or how they were misunderstood geniuses. But rarely has a Prime Minister been so bad or so brief.
That's the thing, isn't it? She spent just 49 days in office. It's not just a Prime Minister like Theresa May, like Boris Johnson, who spent a good couple of years in the gig, and at least they gave it a fair old whack before, the economy came crashing down around them. So, yeah, I think the point is that should Liz Truss, a former Prime Minister, be entitled to this extortionate amount of money from the taxpayer, from the public purse, and also, we're on a cost of living crisis as well. And this is something the government say they've not got money to pay for this, that and the other. We're having £115,000 for this because they have to.
And for Boris Johnson's legal fees.
Definitely, exactly. I think it was £260,000 that the taxpayer spent on Boris Johnson's legal Partygate fees. Again, an extortionate amount of money. We had the National Audit Office just a couple of days ago saying this is actually quite a lot of money and you probably shouldn't have done this.
Those dreadful biased lefties in the, quotes, National Audit Office.
Yes, who are they?
And finally, what does Liz Truss use her office for? Do we know? I mean, because of course you make the point obliquely that she could easily be funding the office with the earnings from these mugs that are paying her fortunes to deliver speeches. But what does the office do?
So it's sort of to run like her day-to-day operations, to, for someone to essentially answer a phone, answer an email, for her security, any sort of, admin costs of being a former Prime Minister. But also, like I say, that security, that people that have to protect her, because obviously she will be under an extra threat as a former Prime Minister. And some people say, well, fair enough. We're happy to pay to make sure that they're protected because, they've come and served our country.
Indeed. Well, couldn't happen to a nicer former Prime Minister. Natasha Clark, welcome aboard. Many thanks. Time is 10:55. Back to this remarkable as political editor, why do you think Rishi Sunak's doing this?
What, the green shift?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting timing, but obviously we saw after Uxbridge, we saw the Conservative Party glimmered a little bit of hope, a little bit of opportunity from going, actually, could this be a wedge issue? Can we divide a big line with Labour over the issue of green, over the issue of cars, banning boilers, all that stuff? And they saw that it allowed them to hold on to Uxbridge. It allowed them to sort of create a little bit of a divide with the Labour Party. And also, he's trying to win an election, like Rosamond was trying to say earlier. He is in a position where he's so far behind in the polls. Really, he needs to try and do something to drag himself out of this if he's got any hope of winning next year.
And would he be surprised to discover that he's managed to alienate outfits like Ford Motoring?
And that will be and the government is obviously going to be prepared for this. But
do you think they would have been? This wouldn't have been absolutely a surprise intervention.
No, not at all. And they've been in talks with these manufacturers, Ford and obviously Tata and other big organisations, including the ones that supported the battery mini plant earlier, their announcement that was last month, and in terms of making more electric vehicles in the country. Rishi Sunak knows that's such an important part of our manufacturing and our industry, and he knows that he needs to keep these guys on side. But we've been waiting for these zero emission manufacturing targets on how many electric vehicles we're going to make from next year for weeks and weeks. And Number 10 and the DfT and other organisations within government have been sitting on this for ages. And that leaves businesses with uncertainty. What are they going to do and when are they going to do it? And businesses just frustrated with not being told.
Prioritising perhaps a hoped-for short-term political boost over both the environment and relations with industry. Knowing what you know, will it definitely happen now? Because you saw last night they responded to a leak, which they don't normally do. They normally make a point of refusing to respond to leaks. But to issue quite a full statement on a leak, I mean, it's definitely going to go ahead, do you think? I think the speech is scheduled for tomorrow.
Yeah, I think it's a bit up in the air at the moment. I think, in number 10, there hasn't been any, I don't think, final decisions from the PM on exactly what he's going to do. But this leak was incredibly well briefed. Like, they had a lot of detail in it. It doesn't usually come out from government like this.
Right.
I think they still will go ahead with it. It depends on exactly what it will look like. I think we can expect that the 2030 car ban will become 2035 in a sliding scale. I think we can expect the 2035 boiler ban to be pushed back in some form. I think we can expect the Prime Minister to be making promises for no more green taxes, no flying taxes, in an attempt to try and really divide this wedge issue.
Right.
When it will come, I think, yes, obviously, number 10 are looking today and are thinking, actually, we've had our announcement completely spoiled for what was scheduled to be, I think, tomorrow. So do they basically wait another 24 hours while everybody speculates about exactly what's going to be in this stuff?
And people like Ford object to what they think is going to be in it.
Exactly. Or do they just come out ahead today and get on the front foot and do it? And I think there are some people in number 10 that would prefer to do it earlier rather than later.
We may see you later then. Natasha Clark, thank you very much indeed. 10:58. Let's squeeze in Jason in Grays on this questionable political manoeuvre to alienate both motor manufacturers and environmentalists. What's your response, Jason? What made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James. I'll tell you why I think Rishi Sunak's doing it. First, I just wanted to help you out next time you're wandering through Uncle Stuart's Facebook page.
Go on.
Because that was what made me call. They all talk about the cost of net zero being horrendously high and everything else. But what nobody tells you is the cost of not going to net zero and continuing to use fossil fuels is double that, more than double the cost of net zero.
Well, under the OBR report that he referred to, it could be up to 10 times more, not just double. I did mention that, but after... Yes, I did, but I think you were probably on hold. And I've looked into where these figures come from in a sort of not reading the OBR report, but reading coverage of the report. And organisations like the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which I think is based at 55 Tufton Street, are very, very prominent in the dissemination of the £1.4 trillion figure without any reference whatsoever to the cost of doing nothing, which I think is the thing that got your goat.
Yeah, I mean, the Office of Budget Responsibility, they're the numbers people.
Yes.
So they've done the calculations, they've done the numbers, and in simplistic terms, the conclusion they found was the cost of net zero has an impact of 6% on GDP. The cost of not hitting net zero is 13%.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line numbers.
So it's a question of cherry picking then. If I'm writing an article for, I don't know, some dodgy blog or the Daily Telegraph, I mean, they're interchangeable these days, then I mention the 1.4 trillion, but I don't mention the doubling of the impact in the event of doing nothing. And people get very cross.
How much is 1.4 trillion? That's not a number that people can get their head around.
No.
6% is.
Yes.
That's the cost of net zero. It's an increase of 6%. The cost of not going for net zero is more than double that, at 13%. That's the conclusion of the OBR.
And if you're going to cite those numbers, that would be the end of the conversation.
Let me tell you why Rishi Sunak's doing it.
Yeah, go on.
Initially, I thought it was about populism and picking up the right-wing vote and the people that hate the environment and they hate ULEZ and they hate clean air and they hate Greenpeace. I thought that was what it is. But have a look at the fossil fuel company share prices today and tomorrow after this speech. Because the United Kingdom, under Rishi Sunak, is one of the only countries in the G20 that is issuing new fossil fuel licenses.
Yeah.
We issue more government taxpayer subsidies to fossil fuel companies than we do renewable energy. And the percentage is much higher than any other country in the world. We are passionate, or this government is passionate about fossil fuels.
But I don't know that the share price will do the things you think it will do, because these are, as I understand it, these are not fossil fuels that will make their way into the tank of a car.
It's gas and oil. Gas and oil, that's where it ends up. Now, if you then look at the lobbyists, and this government, as we know, for the last 10 years at least, have been taking every single penny from the taxpayer they possibly can, and also from lobbyists. So they're well funded by the fossil fuel industry. We know the Conservative Party are very well funded by the fossil fuel industry. That's why they issued all these new licenses of late. Now, Rishi Sunak probably knows he's leaving next year, either through a general election or because he's kicked out by his party when he loses.
Sure.
One or the other will happen. So then you think, they've got 12 months left maybe to scrape as much donations as they possibly can from every single sector. And who's got more money than the fossil fuel industry?
And they would be the only ones really celebrating today, apart from the people who have misread the statistics and the economic forecast that you mentioned. Well, that was a fairly complete hour, wasn't it? Thank you, Jason, for winding things up so nicely. 11 minutes, 1 minute after 11 is the time. I've got an idea of what I want to do next, and it's not dissimilar to what we've just done, but it is also different at the same time. If that doesn't keep you hanging on your radio, then I don't know what will. I'm haunted by my television today. Suella Braverman just popped up on it a moment ago. Okay, so I wasn't going to do this because I thought it would be too similar to the conversation in the last hour, but in many ways it's a natural evolution from the conversation in the last hour, which is about a pretty cynical, certainly populist attempt by Rishi Sunak, who kind of promised not to be a populist when he became Prime Minister. He sort of pledged a departure from the previous ways, which he has abandoned fairly quickly, perhaps inevitably. The idea that you're going to use the war on the motorist as an attempt to drive wedges through the electorate, I'm not sure it will work, because Labour are now left looking like the most environmentally friendly of the two major parties without having done anything. You know, a big problem for Labour is the absence of positivity. I am going to vote for Keir Starmer's Labour Party because I really like X. And on the environment, at least, they're pretty hard to pick apart. They were much of a muchness. We're ahead of some countries with the 2030 deadline, as opposed to the 2035 that Sunak wants to move to. So it is one of those rare areas where we could claim to be world-beating, or at least alongside the world leaders. And what Sunak has done with this speech is essentially hand Labour the mantle of being better on this front. But the calculation must be that there are enough Gaminati out there still sucking at the exhaust pipe of Tufton Street and doing the bidding, as our last caller Jason reminded us, of the fossil fuel industries. But it speaks to something psychological. And so does the story in Wales about a 20-mile-per-hour limit on roads that were previously 30-mile-per-hour. It's a road near my mum. I didn't know, in fact, to talk about highlighting my ignorance, I've already got the day wrong today, but the rules on roads are not something that I would go back on Mastermind with. When I did Clive Myrie on this week's Full Disclosure, he says, you can come back on in 3 or 4 years. I thought I might just have got over the shock and the horror, the fear, the cold terror of that noise in that empty hangar-like TV studio where I go, bom, 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 bom. And I started thinking, what specialist subject could I do if I do go back on it? Because I've got a very, very proud record to protect. It won't be anything to do with the highway code. I think anyone who's listened to the programme as often as twice will know that the petrolhead gene somehow passed me by. But there's a road near my mum where new building and some diversions have seen a huge increase in traffic coming down what is essentially single lane. There's two cars coming towards each other. Then one of them is going to have to take evasive action, and there's been a huge uptick in the number of accidents. There's also a very narrow bridge at one point as well, which doesn't help. And I somewhat naively asked why they don't change the speed limit, but there's no street lighting on this lane, and apparently that impacts what the speed limit can and can't be. I've said that out loud now. My sister told me that, and she does have a petrolhead gene a mile wide, but if she's got that wrong, my inbox is going to go haywire again, isn't it? Oh, well, fingers crossed. 8 minutes after 11 is the time. The point that I'm leaning towards is that there is a furious response to requiring people to drive a bit more slowly in the slowest roads in the country, in Wales. So it currently stands at 30 miles per hour. Every 30 mile per hour zone in Wales has become a 20 mile per hour zone. To which my response is, well, that's a relief, isn't it? Because anyone who's seen the difference in impact on something like a body, never mind another vehicle, between a car travelling at 19 miles per hour or 20 miles per hour compared to a car travelling at 29 miles per hour or 30 miles per hour is pretty profound. And as someone, I can drive. I have got a driving licence. I have driven. I do drive, not very often. But as someone who just thinks it's a no-brainer that the most built-up areas should have cars going as slowly as is reasonable, I can't understand what everybody is angry about. A campaign to ditch Wales's absurd blanket 20-mile-per-hour speed limit has become the most signed petition in the history of devolution. I've had a look at the website. on the Welsh government, at the petition on the Welsh government's official website, which passed 230,000 signatures last night. And as far as I can tell, you don't have to live in Wales to sign it. Are we confident of that? So how many of these 230,000 people will be followers of your Uncle Stuart on Facebook, or indeed kind of ULEZ half-wits? I don't know, but I don't know how significant that figure is given the culture war, the motoring-based culture war, which Rishi Sunak is trying to wage, or rather join. He certainly didn't start it. But it's another story that speaks to the strange psychological relationship between a human and a car. It's mostly men, but not exclusively. But it is mostly men, isn't it? You rarely, I'm not saying you never, but you rarely hear from women screaming from the rooftops about not being able to drive faster in the parts of town where children are most likely to step into the road unexpectedly. 11 minutes after 11 is the time. And when you bring in the other elements that Rishi Sunak is trying to appeal to, you're left with a really interesting question about what I think is psychology. When I started doing this job, and do you want to know something interesting? Well, it's interesting to me. You probably won't care less. But there must come a point when I'm going to stop mentioning my age, mustn't there? Because the reason I mention my age on the show is because when I started here, I was incredibly young for a radio phone-in host. Usually radio phone-in hosts are sort of old and right-wing and angry. And when I started here, I was a refreshing breath of fresh air. Now, arguably, we have managed together to turn that oil tanker around, and now the old angry right-wing men stand out like sore thumbs on our wonderful schedule. But I still mention my age because somewhere deep inside, I still think I'm the young Turk. You know, but there's going to come a point where I won't mention my age because it will make me sound old. I wonder how close I am at the age of 51 after being in the job for about 20 years to reaching that point. I said, don't mention your age. Don't tell them your name, Pike. Don't tell them how old you are, 51-year-old Jack. So I mentioned that only because when I started doing this job, one of the things lots of things surprised me. I wasn't really that familiar with the genre, with the format. I was surprised by how racist some callers were, and I was surprised by the fetishization of the motor car. Now, I understood it fairly quickly. The calculation is, particularly if you're doing the breakfast slot or the drive time slot, that the majority of people listening to the programme are probably going to be in the car. And if they're in the car every day at that time because of the rush hour or the school run or both, then they're probably going to have a particular interest in motoring matters. Mid-morning motoring matters. So mid-morning, oddly, gets a swerve on motoring matters or matters motoring because you're more likely, I think, to be listening to this at home or at work because of the nature of your day. So that is partly why angry old men bang on about motoring all the time. And it strikes me that quite a lot of what this government does panders to what I would describe as the kind of lazy right-wing rhetoric, often slightly racist, that was commonplace on phone-in radio 10, 15, 20 years ago. Banging on about refugees all the time, banging on about immigrants all the time, banging on now about cars all the time. And it's quite scary, isn't it, to think that you have a government led by a man who is, by all accounts, intelligent and, in material terms, highly successful, modern, young, outward-looking, you would hope. And yet, as the election approaches and the polls get worse every day for him, he seeks the support of people who probably disapprove of both his ethnicity, and his education on some level. So, as we turn our attention to this populist motoring fetishization and Sunak's decision to try to suck up to your Uncle Stuart, what explains it? I've never got to the bottom of this. I had a brief flirtation with motoring matters as a schoolboy because you could write off to companies and they would send you stickers. Did you know this? So you could write off to Formula One companies or even tyre companies. ATS had some nice stickers, and we discovered this when we were about 11 or 12. And you had to write a letter every every week at my school. You were supposed to write to your parents or your gran, but we all started writing to Lucas or Jaguar and saying, I am very keen, I'm very interested. I think sometimes we started pretending that we were going to buy one in our 11-year-old handwriting. We say, "Dear Mr. Jaguar, I'm very interested in buying your latest XJS model. I wonder if you could let me have your latest brochures and stickers." I suspect that the "and stickers" was a giveaway for whoever was opening the post at Jaguar headquarters. So, we've got a potential customer here. Pass me a brochure, Anne. I shall pop it in the... Oh, and some stickers. It's another 12-year-old from that prep school in Chaddesley Corbett. And they did send them. We got sent loads of stickers. And I had Top Trumps. I got into cars through Top Trumps. I enjoyed Top Trumps. And obviously, going to fee-paying schools, some of my friends' dads had fancy cars. And you'd go for a ride in a Ferrari, for example, and you would be excited. But then, I guess, sort of shortly after puberty, it just disappeared. I was away at boarding school. I didn't learn to drive because I was away at boarding school, and perhaps foolishly in retrospect, when I was 17, I had a girlfriend who was older than me, and she used to pick me up and drive me everywhere. So I never, in the period where I would have been desperate to learn to drive, I didn't need to, and it has passed me by completely. So one of the reasons why on this programme you never hear us banging on about parking tickets or, what is it, the hard shoulder on the motorway? Or cycle getting angry about cyclists or anything, is because I just don't live it. I don't know it. I don't do it. I don't get it. I don't have any emotional relationship with my car. Is that the right word? Emotional rather than psychological? I don't have any emotional relationship with my car. It's a very useful lump of metal, right? I get a tiny bit annoyed if a bird craps on it, but apart from that, it is an entirely functional contributor to my existence and to my life. So I want you, either from within the group that we're discussing or from without, I want you to explain to me why the motor car is so politically live, why it is so politically emotive, why... And I don't just mean the money, because this isn't just about saying I'm going to charge you to drive. The speed limit has nothing to do with cost. The speed limit is simply telling you to slow down because fewer people will die as a consequence of being hit by cars. Now, to an outsider, to someone who's not part of the fetishization of motoring, that is the closest thing to a no-brainer you're ever going to get. And obviously, the trade-off, the cost-benefit ratio, hits a figure that is both plausible and achievable. So you can't say everyone has to drive everywhere at 5 miles per hour because the economy would grind to a halt. But reducing it from 30 to 20 is clearly not a very big deal, particularly given that an awful lot of the time you won't have been going at 30 in the first place. So what I want you to tell me is not your view on the 20 mile per hour speed limit in Wales, although you can bring that into the conversation if you want. Not your view on Rishi Sunak's attempt to somehow take a side in the war on the motorists that involves being on the side of the motorists but on the opposite side from the motoring manufacturers, which is interesting to say the least. And Andy Cox, actually, who's a wonderful campaigner in this field, I am reminded that he objects to the use of the word accidents, and he's absolutely right. I know Andy, he's a mate of mine, and we always give him a big shout when he undertakes his annual sponsored run. So they're crashes. They are crashes, they are crashes, often involving a ton of metal and a human. So where does it come from? Where does it come from? Why is the motor car or motoring such an emotive subject for so many men? Brackets and some women, close brackets. 0345 6060 973. I'd throw in something else, but I fear it might make me sound snobbish. But in for a penny, hey? So sometimes I am struck by the value of a car outside a house. Okay, so we've always put as much money as we humanly can into our home as a family. And sometimes I'll see a car and I'll know enough about cars to know that car is worth about 60 or 70,000 pounds, and it's outside a house that's worth, say, 5 times that. So you're spending a fifth of, and I look at that and I don't get it. I think that's another example of something that I would loosely file under emotional relationship with a car. Just explain it to me. And I don't even have to pretend to be stupid this hour. I truly am ignorant. I have really no inkling as to what it would be like to feel an emotional bond with a car, which makes it so politically pertinent when someone tells you they're trying to spoil your relationship with your car. That's what Rishi Sunak is doing. They're trying to tell you how fast you can drive down in Wales. They're trying to why? What is it about a car as opposed to, for example, I don't know, a bench that makes people so emotional, so easily manipulated into thinking that they're being persecuted? 0345 6060 973. Have a think. That's a good question, that. It's a good question, but I suspect you've never thought about it before because it's just normal. But it's not, is it? It's 23 minutes after 11, and it's a question that we did ask, I think, at some point in the past, but we certainly haven't asked for a long time, and it's so pertinent now, it's so newsworthy. The only thing I think that the Tories have got in their locker is claiming to be on the side of the motorists in a so-called war on the motorists. And the war on the motorists is, of course, largely built of a desire to protect the actual planet, to protect the environment. But it speaks to something inside. It speaks to something emotional. And I want to know what that is. I should tell you that almost certainly on the as a consequence of the conversation, well, not as a consequence of the conversation we were having in the last hour, but the subject matter of the conversation we were having in the last hour. You never know. Stranger things have happened. They have us on in Downing Street, and possibly policy changes as a result. But it's being reported that Rishi Sunak has called some sort of emergency cabinet meeting, given that they're in recess. I wonder how many will be on Zoom. And that there may even be a press conference later today. So in the annals of leaks, and I think Natasha Clark was alluding to this earlier, our new political editor, in the annals of leaks, this is Premier League. This is a Premier League leak. The detail of it and the substance of it will have really boiled some proverbial in Downing Street. So keep your eyes peeled for that as well. Let's crack on. Dave is in Llandriniaeth, in where? Llandriniaeth. Dave, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Nice to talk to you again. Last time we spoke, I was working as a courier in the middle of lockdown, and now I'm back to working full-time as a musician, so
Fantastic.
Things have changed somewhat.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear it, mate. Well done.
Great. I think this is a massive bandwagon on this occasion.
Well, they're always bandwagons. But carry on. Tell me. Describe the bandwagon before I ask you a question.
The memes online, they've decided that this is a terrible attack on their rights. But firstly, this speed limit change was in Welsh Labour's 2021 manifesto pledges, so it's not something they've landed on people without warning. And secondly, it's not a blanket rule. Many roads are staying at 30 miles per hour. I'll give you an example. So the village I live in has always been 30, and the main road through the village is now still 30 because it's a busy trunk road. They've changed the smaller residential roads with houses to 20, but they've kept the main road at 30.
I'm going to pause you, all right?
Yeah?
You've dived straight in to an angle on this story which highlights why I don't do motoring stories.
You're bored already, aren't you?
I am, yeah.
Yeah.
It's nothing personal, but I couldn't care less about the detail of what is going on in your village, except insofar as it supports your contention that this is a bandwagon largely consisting of misinformation, which I recognise, and I thank you for pointing that out. The fact that it was in the manifesto is quite interesting because, of course, I'm pretty sure the pledge to the 2030 environment stuff that Sunak is rowing back from was actually in the Conservative manifesto. So there's an interesting sort of juxtaposition of manifesto pledges there. But why are people so... Because the question I'm asking is more psychological than automotive. Why are people so primed and keen to jump on any bandwagon that looks like the one you've described? What is it about motoring? In this case, speed, the speed of travel, it's nothing to do with money, that makes people so thin-skinned and hypersensitive.
Well, I'd say one of the things is being behind the wheel gives you a sense of control you might not get elsewhere in your life.
Oh.
And the thought of being told you can't do something you're used to doing behind the wheel, people just find very limiting.
I am master of all I survey in this small box of metal. That's where road rage comes from, when someone else is interfering with your autonomy almost.
Yeah, it's one place, sometimes it's people's safe place in the car. They feel like this is where they're in control, and to have that taken away, I think for some people is quite scary. If
you've not, and the less control you have in other elements of your life, or perhaps the more used you are to control, so you could actually be quite a control freak but the car becomes a focus. It becomes a distillation of control. Wow. I like that a lot. I suspect that will be an avenue, if you pardon the pun, that other people go down as well. Do you see, Dave, because I feel bad now for telling you that you were boring me, do you see why that is more interesting than the other stuff?
Definitely, yeah. And my wife will definitely agree with you that I do tend to get a bit boring sometimes.
No,
so
you don't. You know, it's not you.
That.
It's not you. It's me. It's my. But I am much more. I mean, I just found when you said that, my ears pricked up. It's about control. It's about sitting there and feeling a sense of control that then those pesky, interfering, whatever they are, politicians, pedestrians, cyclists, they're interfering with your freedom to ride. Just speaks to me on a level that the finer detail of speed limits and specific roads does not. But I recognise that's me being a little bit unfair. Thank you, Dave. Peter is in Fathersham. Peter, what would you like to say?
I'm sort of you sort of hit the point going now, but yes, my whole thing was to ring up and say like the illusion of freedom. Basically, people have this illusion in their head about vehicles that they can get in them at any point and go as far as they want to go, and no one can stop them. But you know, I think I'm right on this, but I'm not entirely sure. I haven't got figures or anything in front of me. But basically, we've had the power to restrict speed in cars ever since we put computer chips in control of them, and that would save thousands of lives a year in children and everyone else.
Yes.
But it's just too hot a potato to say. I mean, and, you know, we have a speed restriction in this country. You know, we have speed restrictions. So why do we build cars that go faster than the speed limit?
Yeah, I don't know. Why do we build cars that go faster than the speed limit?
Just because it's that thing of people can't cope with, like, you know,
restrictions. Take back control.
Yeah.
Take back control. I wonder how many people, I mean, the more fetishistic you are, the more fetishistic your relationship with your motor car is, the more likely you are to have voted for Brexit. What do we reckon?
It's possible. It is possible because people are so desperate. You know, people are so desperate to think they get over control of their lives and stuff that they cling on to all these little things that have meaning to them.
There is a nice element of this. There's a much more generous and sympathetic analysis which actually speaks perhaps to the same psychological processes, Peter. This texter says, it's a safe private place that you control. I get anxious on trains, buses and planes, but not in my car. Now, I like that person.
Yeah, I'd agree. And, you know, we are, you know, again, we're all kind of human, aren't we? You know, we all have...
So. Although Suella Braverman keeps popping up on my television screen, which does make me wonder.
Yeah, I've not met her in person, so I can't comment. But it is just that thing of, you know, I think the other thing is coming so soon after lockdown, I think that's playing into people's, you know, indignity about having their freedoms taken away. Again, you know, from my point of view, you know, the sensible thing to do in a lockdown was not travel and stay at home. But for a lot of people, they were more upset that they couldn't go on holiday 3 times a year. And I think that feeds into the same...
And never the twain shall meet. People like you and me will never understand fully people like them because it's visceral, it's emotional, it's not rational.
Yes, it's about, you know, we're talking with, you know, in some areas, faiths here about, you know, what they believe.
Yes, I think you're right. You're going to have to drive at 20 miles per hour. Oh, right, fine. You're going to have to drive at 20 miles per hour. Oh, my God, how dare you? Do you see what I mean? Those are two camps that are never really going to find much common ground.
In a really, you know, like, you know, silly and jovial point of this as well, I used to think that actually if people drive around with a big spike in the middle of their steering wheel, they would actually drive a lot carefuler and go a lot slower.
Yeah, but the overall casualty rate would probably increase.
Yeah, maybe.
especially if you're doing an emergency stop during your driving test, you flump.
Yeah.
It's 11:35. Cy is in Wolverhampton. He says, I'm a massive car nut, James. I nearly did the accent then. I don't know. Cy might be from Johannesburg. He's just fetched up in Wolverhampton. It would have been an outrageous presumption to try and to do my black country accent. I'm a massive car nut, and I couldn't be more Remain if I tried. I know there are a lot of like-minded souls on Twitter too. Us folk who live and breathe cars aren't all raging gammons. Cheers, mate. Love the show. I didn't mean to suggest that you were, but if you're having a fit about a reduction in a speed limit in some areas of Wales from 30 miles per hour to 20 miles per hour, then that's who I'm talking about, not car nuts. I get loving cars. What I don't get is the emotional extension almost of personality into vehicle. 36 minutes after 11 is the time. Emily is in Torquay. Emily, what would you like to say?
Hi there, James. Lovely to be on the show at last.
Welcome.
With you.
Yes,
I've been on before. So I think what I told one of your team is that my husband came out with a very succinct answer to your question. It's a sort of physical extension of someone's ego at times, and I think you've kind of covered that in the way that people inside their little sort of metal boxes, they're in their own little world, and it's something that they can control when everything else feels out of control.
They can't really, can they? I mean, I don't. You can't control how fast the car in front of you is going.
No, absolutely not. But what I'm saying is that sometimes people's personality, they associate themselves with their cars.
Yeah.
And they kind of, it's a slight blurring between themselves and the car, in the same way that sometimes people sort of start to resemble or behave even like their own dogs.
Yes.
In that funny way, or they dress their dog up and they treat it like an extension of themselves. I think a car can be like that. I've always been for smaller cars, low emissions cars. I have lived in London all my life. I only just moved here, really. And, I do support the measures to reduce congestion because my lungs have suffered over the years.
Yes, of course. I mean, most people's have, whether we realise it or not. But they're different things, aren't they? It's someone asking for more money from you to carry on doing something tomorrow that you didn't have to pay for yesterday. I can get my head around.
Sure.
But not that, I want to carry on burning as much fossil fuel as I want without any restrictions or penalties at all. You and I struggle to understand. And then that you're going to have to go a little bit slower there because it will save lives. I really struggle to understand, even with the extension of ego into the vehicle.
Sure. I think, extrapolating a bit from that, things like scooters and little mopeds or, even delivery drivers, they're on deadlines as well. They are paid commission. So there's a danger in those smaller vehicles which aren't as visible. They don't show up in your mirrors quite as easily. You haven't got a big old broad fisheye lens on your side mirrors.
No.
I noticed with my driving instructor the other day, because I'm relearning, that he has a special little mirror at the base of the side mirrors that gives you a much broader aspect so that he can see.
More than, yeah, of course.
And, they are kind of available to buy, so that you get a proper broad scope view behind you.
Makes sense, doesn't
it does, and possibly, the lads who came screaming past on bikes on a double white line and should not have been overtaking on a little country lane, Richard might have seen them, as my husband, and it was just because I heard and saw out of the corner of my eye that